focusing on one sefer throughout the years that we start to see themes repeat themselves and kind of support each other, add new aspects and perspectives as we go through. So we're going to look at two pieces from the Shem MiShmuel today. Again, for folks that are new, the Shem MiShmuel was the second in the dynasty of Sochachav. The dynasty of Sochachav was started by his father, the Bnei Yisrael, Rabbi Fyvel Shuster, who was the son-in-law of the Kotzker Rebbe. Okay, so that's in the Hasidic League lineup. That's how the teams come out. He had a great yeshiva in Poland and many great Talmidim. So these are what we're learning are his pieces from what he would say on Shabbos and the Moadim. So we're going to look at two treatments. Hopefully we'll have time to see the two different ways he works on a set of 4 words that are in the Parashas. People are familiar with the 4 Lashonos of Geula, right? That the 4 cups that we have at the Leil HaSeder correspond to the 4 languages that HaKadosh Baruch Hu used describing how he's going to redeem us. And those are V'hotzesi, V'itzalti, V'ga'alti, V'lakachti. Okay, those are the 4. I'll take out, I will save you, V'ga'alti, I'll redeem you, and V'lakachti is I will take you or bring you, and that phrase is the one we're going to look at because it finishes up. Welcome again to everybody, right? Right? V'lakachti eschem li la'am. I will take you to me as a nation. Seems pretty basic. The Hebrew language is the root of everything. Meaning, the reason that the Torah cannot be translated properly is that the nuances and the levels of every aspect of every word in the Torah are really endless. The Shem MiShmuel jumps on the fact that Hashem says, "V'lakachti eschem li la'am." I will take you to me to be an am, a nation. Okay, what's the problem with that? Well, he says, when you look at how Chazal divide up the 4 languages of Geula, "V'lakachti eschem li la'am" refers to the giving of Torah at Har Sinai. Right? That's really the language. Lakachat is a language even of marriage, and the theme of Har Sinai is really a marriage between Hashem and the Jewish people. And the problem is that at that exalted level that they're going to be then, it describes them as Am. Now, the Mefarshim in the Torah, Rashi brings this in Sefer Bamidbar, the Ramban brings this in a few places, says that the Jewish people are referred to in different places in the Torah by different words. The word Am is when we're at our low state. The word Am is the lowest common denominator Jew. Okay, Ami, my nation, that's much better. Yisrael, much better. The Malbim, who does a lot of work with words, he says, Am is actually a positive description vis-a-vis other nations. But within the Jewish people, Am represents Jews at their lowest state. Okay, now, the question is obvious. At Har Sinai, we should have been at our highest state. Why would it describe us as Am at that point? Now, why would the word Am describe something at its low point? He said his father, the Bnei Yisrael, explained the word Am in a very beautiful way. Coals that have burnt down so that the flame is really just inside the coal. You don't see the flames leaping up. Those are called gechalim omemot in Hebrew. Okay, Ein Vav Mem, Mem Vav Tov, omemot. That means that they're kind of smoldering, right? It means that the flame is there, but it's inside. It's not evident outside. He said when the Jewish people are described as Am, that means the potential that we have is there. Who we are is always there. But it's not being expressed externally as it should. It's not out there. Okay? Hop on in, please. Welcome. Okay, so now, this is what we're looking at. 2 approaches that the Shem MiShmuel uses. One is that Am represents a state of bitul, meaning Am represents people that aren't expressing their own inherent power, but they are what they are. He says this actually can be very positive in terms of our relationship with Hashem. Meaning, Am, stand alone. That means we're not actualizing our potential. But liot li la'am, if you are an Am to me, that means you are being what's called mevatel yourself to me. And when the Jewish people are mevatel themselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, meaning we're saying, we're not coming here as supermen ourselves. We're coming here as your people. Once we express ourselves as our people, suddenly that's the greatest level we can reach. That was what was happening with Kabbalat Torah. That was what was happening at Har Sinai. And it's expressed by those words, Na'aseh v'nishma. Na'aseh v'nishma is a fascinating phrase. It means, yes, we are smart people. Yes, we could figure things out, but that's not going to have any bearing on our accepting of the Torah and our performance of the Torah. Naseh. We're just an Am. We're your Am. You tell us what to do. Right? You say jump and let us know when we can come down. Right? That's the idea of Li La'am. And that is a very beautiful and powerful aspect of Am Yisrael. He says it shows two sides that the Jewish people have. It means that we have the potential to be very intelligent, to understand, to use our minds and our feelings and our connection to Judaism. But it depends vis-a-vis whom. He brings the pasuk from Shir Hashirim, Yonati b'chagvei hasela. Okay, he says that Am Yisrael are described in the mashal as my dove in the cleft of the rock. Okay, a dove, but not a dove, Yonah b'chagvei hasela, Yonati, my dove. Why? The Medrash explains. It says, Etzli him ki Yonah potah. When they're with me, says Hashem, the Jewish people are like this very gentle dove. But, he says, if the Umot ha'olam ba'im levatlan min Torah, if the nations of the world are coming to try to separate them from the Torah, suddenly, he said, they're kashim kechayot. Then they turn into wild animals. Then they turn into leopards. Then they fight with all the powers that they have. And this is this beautiful picture of the two sides of the Jewish people. It's used also in describing David HaMelech. There's a character in Tanakh, Adino ha'etzni. And Chazal said that refers to David HaMelech, who was adin ketola'at when he was learning Torah. He was as malleable as a worm when he was learning Torah. Right? A worm, I used to play with earthworms when I was a kid. I don't know who else did, right? They're very flexible. I wasn't cruel, just, it's just nice to see how they can kind of move and be any shape. That was how David HaMelech was when he was learning Torah, meaning he was absorbing, and he was creating his shape as he learned what Hashem wanted. Ha'etzni, but he was kasheh ke'etz b'milchama. When he had to go to war, he was strong as wood. He was powerful. He had all those things. And this is a very fascinating double side of the Jewish people. Okay? The greater a person is, the more meaningful is that act of bittul to Hashem. This is why he says the idea of li, when it says in our parasha, v'lakachti etchem li la'am, I will take you to me as a nation. He said the word li is a code word that Rashi points out to us in Bechukotai Telechu. And because it continues on there, it says, V'im lo tishma'u li. If you will not listen to me. You always got to look in the Torah when a word seems extra. What would be missing if the pasuk just said, V'im lo tishmu, if you don't listen? Hashem's talking, we know what it's about. What's the li? Rashi brings from Chazal. That's Yodea et ribono mitkaven limrod bo. That's someone who knows his master and is intentionally rebelling against the master. That's im lo tishma'u li. So he says, now flip it around here in the description of v'lakachti etchem li la'am. Li means you know me. You have knowledge of me. You want to connect to me, but you do it in terms of am. You do it in terms of let me receive from you. Let me do that which you want. I am not basing it all on the knowledge that I have. Okay, and this is a very interesting contradiction in Avodas Hashem. Jews are the people of the book. Jews are people who learn. Jews are people who constantly ask questions. Okay, it's that's our way of learning, and that should always be known. There's a very wrong stereotype out there that Torah observant Jews don't ask questions. Okay, I remember reading in the New Yorker magazine once. That's when I was reading a New Yorker magazine. There was this book review about a book that was written by a woman trying to describe her Orthodox upbringing, and she gives this scene where she's at the Seder table, and she kind of pipes up and says, "Why was it fair for God to punish Paro if God hardened Paro's heart?" And she describes all her relatives shushing her and saying, you don't ask things like that. Right? We know that question. All the Mepharshim ask that question. Rambam speaks about it. We encourage questions. There's an idea of how you ask. So here, Am Yisrael are people of knowledge, are people who devote themselves to learning and asking and looking and studying. Yet, when it comes to performing, when it comes to doing, we do it only because Hashem told us to. That's the only thing that's there. So he says, therefore, a person if a person doesn't know that much and says, well, I'm going to do this because that's what we do, that's not such a big thing. But a person who's yodea tam Torah mitzvot, a person who's learned Torah in depth, a person who knows what it's about, he says, the person even realizes that these actions he performs as a Jew performing the Torah are his very life and bring life to the world. Nonetheless, he says, that isn't why he does it. He does it because Hashem said so. Okay, if you remember back, those people were here when we learned in a shir about Avram Avinu, and the Shem MiShmuel brought the praise to Avram Avinu as taking on Hashem's aspect of chesed because he buried Sarah. Right? And the Shem MiShmuel basically asks, why is that so great? Is he going to leave her in the backyard? Right? He buried her. And he explained it was because Avram Avinu did that because the attribute of chesed of Hashem that we are supposed to be internalizing and acting upon, that was why he did it. Even though it was his wife Sarah who he loved and who he cried for afterwards, but he so internalized Hashem's desire for things to be done in the world that was why and how he did it. Okay, so this is the aspect that he describes. So Am Yisrael, even with all of their knowledge, when it comes to performing the mitzvah, they will do it as if they don't know anything. This is a drasha of Chazal on the pasuk Adam uvehema toshi Hashem. Hashem will save man and beast. Now, behema is a particular type of beast. Behema refers to domesticated animals. And they say they're elu bnei adam shem arumim bedat umesimim atzmam ki behema. These are people who are adam, they have das. They know Torah, they know things, but when it comes time for doing, they do it as a domesticated animal follows its master. We do it in that way. So when we look at this, it's hard to put together. On one hand, we're supposed to learn, and learning is the lifeblood of the Jewish people, and we're supposed to understand. But we're never supposed to come to that danger point where our motivation for the mitzvah is coming from ourselves and our learning. All of that learning, and again, especially in the Hasidic Yisrael, the purpose of learning is what's called dvekus, is connecting to Hashem. And in fact, when a person learns properly, a person more and more is batel to Hashem. They say in the early years of Hasidus, there was an argument about the approach to learning Torah in the world of Hasidus, because sometimes they would point out many valuable things even an ignorant Jew could do. So some people felt that they were undervaluing the value of Torah study. So I think it was the Toldos Yaakov Yosef said, He said, there are people out there who say in Yiddish, Hasidim lernen nicht. Hasidim don't learn. He said, they're right, but it just has to be punctuated differently. Hasidim lernen, comma, nicht. Hasidim learn, but what they get from their learning is bitul, is that sense of who am I, what am I, as opposed to becoming arrogant the more knowledge they have. So let's try to see how important this is. There's a fascinating Zohar Kodesh that he describes here. He says, mitzvahs she'osim b'li ol, if a person performs mitzvahs without the yoke, okay, what does the yoke represent? We talk about Kabbalas ol malchus shamayim in Kriya Shema. We accept upon ourselves the yoke of heaven. The yoke is that which goes over the shoulders of an ox, and therefore, when the ox is told to go forward, the ox pulls the plow, and that plows your field. So the Zohar Kodesh says, what about a person who does mitzvahs, but without the yoke? What would that look like? A person who says, yeah, I love this Jewish tradition. I love doing this. I actually learned a lot about it, and it represents so many things to me, and it resonates with me, and I do this thing, right? But are you doing it because you're obligated to do it? No, I just like it. Okay, so what's missing afterwards? Okay, so he says, that is like an ox that doesn't have a yoke. Now, we got to use our imagination. When they're talking about something, we have to see this. And it's a very simple thing to imagine. You have a plow. You have an ox. Usually, what connects the ox to the plow is the yoke. Here we have no yoke. So you kind of give the ox a little patch in the hindquarters. You say, giddy up. And the ox walks off. And your plow sits there doing nothing. Okay, now Shem MiShmuel asks, he says, wait a second, but how can this be compared? He says, in the image of the ox, nothing happens. Here we're talking about a person who did the mitzvah, he's just doing it without that yoke. He did it. He did the mitzvah. He shook a lulav, he ate matzah, he helped an old lady across the street. He did something real. How can you compare it to that ox that's not connected to the yoke? He explains, based on a principle he quotes many times from his father. He says, we throw out, people like to hang out in mystical places, we like to throw out mystical phrases, and we'll say, our mitzvahs change the Olamas Ha'elyonim, the upper worlds. Okay? There are worlds upon worlds upon worlds. And the source code of each lower world is in the world above it. And when we do our mitzvahs, we're rewriting the source code in the higher worlds. So his father asked kind of in a very practical way, how do I do that? If I don't know where these worlds are or how they work or anything about them, why in the world should some action that I do, right? I'm eating a piece of matzah at the Seder and you're telling me the source code's getting all rewritten. How can I do something in a realm that I know nothing about? I don't know where it is or how to access it or what I'm doing. So he says it's all based on the principle that we find in halacha called shlucho shel adam kamoso. You can make, the closest thing we have in our world is what's called power of attorney in certain ways. Meaning I can't get to a certain office, but I want something done, so I empower someone. I sign a document saying this person has the power to do XYZ, as if it were me. A shliach in halacha, it's even more so, right? The shliach can really do things. The most powerful example, which Chazal said not to do, okay, I'll especially emphasize this for the Ezras Nashim. Chazal said not to be mekadesh a woman through a shliach. But theoretically, if there was a guy who was just so tired of the whole dating process, he tells a more happening friend of his, he says, listen, here's a ring, here's a description of me, could you go find me a good one? And this guy goes out there and he introduces himself and he says, hi, no, actually not for me, but I have this friend, Shlomi, this is his description. He's a really great guy, would you like to get engaged to him? And if she says yes, he can call over 2 kosher witnesses and give her a ring and say, Hareat Mekudeshet to my friend Shlomi, B'tabazu, Kedas Moshe Yisrael. And it works as if he was Shlomi. Okay, again, Chazal cursed someone who does this. You're never supposed to be Mekadesh a woman without meeting her for a whole variety of different reasons. But this shows us the power of shlichus. So therefore, when Hashem commands us to do a mitzvah, Asher kiddushanu v'mitzvosov v'tzivonu, He is making us a shliach to do that mitzvah. That means that suddenly when we do it in that way, in the context of v'tzivonu, of putting on that yoke, suddenly we are imbued with divine powers. Suddenly, yes, those actions that we do are able to transform the universe, even though I cannot explain to you how my matzah is transforming the universe, but we're able to do it because of that.
They transform us.
Huh?
They transform us.
Correct.
And because we're down here in the universe, we can transform.
And by accepting that yoke, suddenly, right, we have all of those powers. So he said that is the idea of Lakachti etchem li la'am, meaning only when you have that level of bittul to enter that system are you able to accomplish all those things that you received at Har Sinai. Otherwise, it's true, the level of am would be potential that hasn't been actualized. Okay, so this is, he said, the roots of the power of this idea. And according to this, we see that the highest level of a mitzvah, even if a person learns and should learn and know more, he says, Lo tia yidiato betam hamitzvot tofeset makom klal. When he's doing the mitzvah, and you ask him, why are you doing this mitzvah? The only really active engine inside of that person at the time is because this is what Hashem wants me to do. Right? Afterwards, you can sit with the person and you can learn with them endless Torah about the mitzvah and what and why and all the things of the mitzvah. But the reason now is because of this, because I'm a shliach, because this was the mission I was given and that I'm doing, and that doesn't minimize us. That actually makes us greater. Okay? So this is one approach from the Avnei Nezer to this idea of Lakachti etchem li la'am. Right, that you're being mevatel yourself to me, and that aspect of am, which is negative in terms of a person not really expressing their knowledge and personality as a standalone, but when it's li la'am, that means you're opening yourself up to all of that power from the connection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, now in another year, he treats this in a slightly different way. The same question from his father. Why does it say, describe Am Yisrael as Am in V'lakachti etchem li la'am at Har Sinai? Why describe them as Am, which is the lowest level of the Jewish people? So he explained, and this ties into some things we learned in the last couple of weeks. We go through different cycles in our lives. Sometimes we're up, sometimes we're down. Sometimes we're feeling it, sometimes we're not feeling it. Sometimes we understand it, sometimes we don't. As we mentioned before, in Svarim they describe these two modes in general as Mochin the Gadlus, the big mind, and Mochin the Katnus, the little mind. When it's time of the Mochin the Gadlus, the big mind, you're connected, you feel it, you sense it, you want it, it resonates with you, all of those things are happening. Mochin the Katnus is when I don't feel any of that, and yet I go ahead and I do it. Now, through our eyes, that which we do in a time of Mochin de Katlas really isn't very valuable, right? It's, you went through the motions, your heart wasn't in it, your head wasn't in it, you did it, for whatever reason, okay, I'm a Jew, I gotta do this, I'm not into it right now, but I do it. So he says, that has tremendous power. Because again, Am is from the language of Gechalim Omamot, smoldering coals. Okay, these coals which have this fire in them. And therefore, he says, the Jewish people have it in them even when they're not activating it, even when they're not feeling it. And that again comes from this idea of Naseh before Nishma. The way the Torah was received was not received on the basis that I will understand this, I will internalize it, I will relate to it, I will desire it, I will enjoy it, and then I'll do it. It was, I will do it, and then I'm going to try to learn as much of it as I can and to connect to it and to understand it more and better. So therefore, because the Torah was accepted in that way, that's become part of our national character inheritance. That even performing Torah and mitzvahs in that way is powerful. Okay? And then Hashem fulfills the second part of the deal. V'nishma. He says, you may think that how is the person then ever going to really get into the mitzvah if he's performing it before understanding it? Judaism doesn't work in the same way as other areas in life. Naseh v'nishma. When you do it, you will then understand it. Particularly because of the power of doing things even when you're not connected to it, then you're able to come to nishma and you're able to get it and to understand it. Okay, we have to realize that so many times a person drops off because they just feel it's hopeless. They feel, what am I accomplishing? I'm not doing this very well. Nobody likes to keep doing something they're not good at. And when day after day in our Judaism we're doing stuff because I have to, I heard I'm supposed to, and then you start reading a book that, you're supposed to have your heart in it, and you're supposed to understand these things, and a person says, well, I don't, you can start to drop off. I'll just give you a fascinating example that I read about. It's interesting in and of itself, and it's not exactly a parallel, but it has a connection. I was reading the memoirs of someone who was named Rabbi Geldsaler. Rabbi Geldsaler was a son-in-law of the famous Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, the Michtav Meliyahu, and he was his Hasidic son-in-law. Okay, he had a Hasidic son-in-law. He writes many interesting things in his memoirs about Rav Dessler's connection to Hasidus. And he was saying something from his father, who had lived in England. I forget where it was, this place, way out in the middle of England. And he said that his... It wasn't, Rav Dessler was in Gateshead, but this was his mechutin, who was in a place, Darlington. I looked it up on the computer. There's only a Reform synagogue there now. But he lived in Darlington. And he wrote, he told his son, he said, I was trying to take a look at why so many devout Eastern European Jews kind of fell off when they came to Western Europe. And here was an interesting idea that he had. He said, I saw a correspondence between communities where men would use the mikveh, even occasionally, before Shabbos, even before Yom Tov, even just before Rosh Hashanah, and ones where they wouldn't. Why? He says, one of the great challenges in that shift from Eastern Europe to Western Europe is that women had a very hard time with the mitzvah of mikveh. It was scorned. It was made fun of at the time. It was often framed as some kind of primitive punishment for women or something that denigrated women. And unfortunately, the state of many mikvos reinforced that. They were not very nice. He said, if it was a community where the women would hear that the men somehow are involved with mikveh, right? So then they say, okay, it's not something which is just for women. Men got to suffer through it also. Said also, if the men would go to mikveh, they had a better concept of what a mikveh should be like and what it shouldn't be like, and the standard of mikvahs could get better. So he said, in the places where the women stopped going to mikveh, the men oftentimes said that is such a basic aspect of Jewish observance, and if that's not there, what's the point of doing anything else? We just can't feel that, which is a mistake. It's a very bad mistake to do, but that's a sign that when a person loses their heart, loses their connection, loses their hope, and they think, so then what could it possibly do if I do X, Y, and Z? Everything has that power. And even if you don't understand what or how, it is powerful in that way. Okay, so this is the power of things that are done, even without kavanah. He brings a fascinating Gemara. It's spoken about many times, about what will happen in the future. Okay, the Gemara in Masechus Avodah Zarah brings us a dialogue between God and the nations of the world when everything settles down, Mashiach comes, things are revealed. So he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings us Sefer Torah, and he reveals himself in the world, and he said, one who did not do this, Misha Asakba, one who did it, shall come and get their reward. Someone who didn't, sorry. So the nations of the world come and they protest. Right? They say, why don't we get anything? And he says, B'maya Saktim, what did you guys do? And they say, Ribono Shel Olam, we made marketplaces, we made bathhouses, we had kesef and zov, we built economies, and everything we did was so that your people, Am Yisrael, would be able to learn and keep the Torah. So why shouldn't we get rewards? Hashem says to them, you're not fooling me. Everything you did for yourselves. He said, your marketplaces were the place where you wanted zonas, prostitutes, to ply their trade. Your mechatzos, your bathhouses you did to pamper yourselves. The money, right? He says, all money is mine. The pasuk says, Li hakesef v'li hazov. You were doing it for your own desires. Okay, so therefore he says, only those people who really kept my Torah and did those things, right, will get rewarded. So the question, he asked it, I heard in the question, the name of the Brisker Rav also. Again, this is a future dialogue, but when you see a future dialogue in Chazal, that means that the dialogue exists, essentially. The dialogue by the very nature of the Torah and the nations and Hashem, this dialogue has to happen. So the question is, could they possibly try to put one over on Hashem? This is not like your Uncle Louis that you're trying to tell a story to. This is Hashem who knows everything. And that's a pretty, risky gambit to try and stand there bold-faced and you say, everything we did in the history of our nations, we did so your Jews could keep mitzvahs and learn Torah. Okay? How could they say that? There's got to be something to it. He says, because when the world is kind of revealed and clarified at that point, you will actually see that was true. That was true. That all of the different things that they developed, all of these things were all in the framework of how they would enable the Jewish people to fulfill their mission as they went through things. He quotes the Rambam. I did not find the source in the Rambam. It sounds like a piece in Moreh Nevuchim. That he says, Shekolis askus ha'olam, anything which is developed in the world, u'avur yirei shamayim echad, is for one God-fearing Jew. V'kama shanim yituchu livnot v'linta. It could be that people will spend years in a certain project. Hakol kedei shebe'echad hayamim yavur yirei shamayim echad b'oto makom v'yimtza bo manoach. So that one God-fearing Jew will pass by there at some point, and he needs a place to rest, and they built whatever it is, the Eiffel Tower or the Empire State Building or something like this, and he gets to pop in there and buy a Coke. That was why it was there. It's interesting. Okay, now I saw, this Reb Shia Geltzer actually brought from Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, that this is really what's meant when it says that Am Yisrael went into Golus l'harbot gerim, right, to find more gerim, to find converts. So in many ways, that's also true. Jews are spread throughout the world. Knowledge of Judaism spreads throughout the world. But Reb Tzadok says what it means is to convert the developments that are out in the world. He says everything that develops in the world has an application to Judaism. And our spreading through the world enables us to connect to these things. And that's the ultimate purpose of those things. The ultimate purpose of this camera is for the share, right? The ultimate purpose of the internet is for people to be able to see the share afterwards, right? These things are there, and that's what's viewed as an idea of giur, of converting these different developments and processes to Torah. Okay, so that's what's happening here. Now the question is, based on our Torah, deeper. Chazal say that if a person is walking along the street and a coin fell out of your pocket and a poor person picked up the pocket, you were considered to have done the mitzvah of tzedakah. Okay, now you didn't know the poor person was there. You really did not plan for 5 shekel to fall out of your pocket and to go to a poor person. You were planning to buy a Coke with that 5 shekel. But that's what happened, and it's considered that you've done that. So therefore, the question of the nations of the world takes on a more powerful aspect. Okay, so you got us. We didn't really mean it, but nonetheless, it's like that coin that falls out of the pocket. It happened. Everything we did benefited your Jewish people. Time for payback. Hashem answers, and he explains that the reason that it counts for them is because they said na'aseh v'nishma. Lakachti etchem li la'am. They said, just deeds. We will do. We don't have to know. We don't have to understand. Only because they entered that covenant with me in that way, that the actions that they do, even without intention, count. You weren't part of that, so therefore your unintentional actions have no connection to the end result. So it's a fascinating analysis of it, right? It's a fascinating picture. And the takeaway for us is the following. The value of Torah and mitzvahs that are done, even when your mind's not there, even when your heart's not there. The gift of the relationship that was formed at Har Sinai through Na'aseh v'Nishma, li la'am, when you are an am, when you are at your lowest state, when you look like a dead coal, I can see no flame in you. The flame is there smoldering inside, but nobody can see it. Even in such a stage, you are li, because the terms of engagement with Torah weren't based on nishma first. It wasn't based on your kavanah and your understanding and your enthusiasm and all of those things. It was based on nasa, and that has value as well. And this is important because, as we said last week, there are many, many times in life, and the shifts of mochin the gadlus and mochin the katnus are myriad. It can be a period in your life, it can be a period in your day, it can be one aspect of Judaism, or it can be another aspect of Judaism. And to be able to keep on trucking, a person has to feel that that has value. I'll give you an example in the area where it hits us the hardest. When I was a kid in school, they used to have us chirp this kind of declamation that we'd go, Tefillah b'lo kavana, hi keguf b'li neshama. Right? Tefillah without kavana is like a body without a soul. Right? Meaning, if you guys got no kavana, your tefillah is a dead corpse. That was what they told us. And it's kind of disheartening going on through life with that playing in my head, as there have been so many different tefillahs I've had without kavana. Okay, so a person, particularly with that example of tefillah, thinks, okay, even if you'll tell me another mitzvah, the coin that fell from my pocket and the poor person picked it up, okay, the poor person now has 5 shekel. That's something that happened. I shook a lulav on sukkahs, even though I really wasn't in the mood and I had no idea why I spent all this money on these overpriced vegetables, but I shook. At least I did it. But tefillah seems to be something that's entirely the work of the mind and the heart. It's all kavanah. Can that have any value? So I was very, very happy when I found the following. There's a little bit complicated halachic scenario, so ride with me because it's worth it, as you'll see at the end of the ride. There was someone here in Yerushalayim, Rav Chaim Brim, his name is. Rav Chaim Brim was an old Rizhiner Chassid, a Bayaner Chassid, and very close to the Chazon Ish as well. He was a very, very special person. He said, imagine the following scenario. It's the summer, okay? It's Friday night, and someone very tired is in shul. Now, what can happen, and I can say this because it has happened to me, Friday night, you're zoned out, and you're davening Ma'ariv, and instead of, after Mechaya Mesin, going into Ata Kidashta and Vayechu, the Friday night davening, you cruise right on in autopilot into the weekday Shemon Esrei. Ata Chanin L'Adam Das. Usually the place you notice is at Tzlach Lanu. When that thump happens and suddenly, wait a second, you know, I'm the only one in shul, and then you do this kind of wipe it away motion and hope that nobody saw. Okay, the halacha is that you're supposed to finish the bracha that you're in the middle of. So here we have a person who was so zoned out that he went into the weekday Amida, he went all the way through, and he forgot that it was the summer. So in Barech Aleinu he said, V'tein talu matar livracha al pnei adama. And he cruised all the way through, and suddenly he realized, wait a second, why did I daven longer than anyone else? I'm usually finished first. Oh, right, they did the Friday night one, and he suddenly says, it's warm here, and I remember saying V'tein talu matar. What does he do? So he said the halacha is he has to go back to the beginning of Shemon Esrei. He has to say all the brachas through and including Baruch Aleinu, but instead of saying V'tein Talamatar, he says V'sein Bracha, or if he's Sephardi, he says Baruchenu. And then he shifts back into the Shabbos Shemon Esrei. Why? Because you uttered with your mouth the words V'tein Talamatar in the summer in Israel, and that tefillah is based on the Israeli agricultural cycle, where rain is viewed as a siman klala. It is not good for the agriculture to have rain coming in the middle of our hot, dry summer season. And the guy's going to say, but I had like negative kavanah. I was like so not there. I forgot that it was Friday. I forgot that it was summer, right? I was saying the weekday Shemon Esrei, or at least my lips were. I wasn't there. Why should that make any difference? He said the halacha shows that it did. The very fact that you uttered those words did something. They tell a story about a person, there was a very special Rebbe who was one of the last Hasidic Rebbes in Russia, the Ribnitzer Rebbe. And at one point he had a very special limited minyan that only 10 people could come join this minyan. It was later in the day, this minyan, and the terms were that you were coming to daven with the Rebbe. That means you didn't daven beforehand. So people lined up to get a chance to go into the Ribnitzer Rebbe's minyan. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Number 8 comes by, and each time the gabbai checked, he said, "You didn't daven yet?" He says, "No." And in he goes. Number 8 comes in, and the Rebbe looks at him. He says, "I'm sorry." He says, "You've davened already. We need 10 people who haven't davened." And the guy walks out. And the gabbai saw this happen, and he is so angry. And especially because he sees this person smiling. He's like smiling from ear to ear. He says, "You lied to me? You lied to the Rebbe? You tried to come to this minyan false pretenses, and you were smiling?" He said, "I got to explain to you." He said, "I never thought my davening did anything. Like I never have any kavanah or something." Here the Rebbe looked at me, instantly said, "You've davened shacharis already. That means it must do something. I must have accomplished something. It must be there." We do have that power. We have the power, as we saw in the first piece, from the shlichus, from the vitzivonu, which is there. As we saw in the second piece, that the very terms of Nasiv and Ishma, Li La'am, means that Hashem accepted us, drew us to Him, even when we're only the Am. As Rashi said, at the lowest state, Jewish lowest common denominator, functioning in the Jewish lowest common denominator, without our minds, without our hearts, without our souls, nonetheless, we're always Li La'am. And that connection makes everything happen. So I found these pieces from the Shem MiShmuel very encouraging, very empowering. But again, realize that this Torah is not coming to devalue learning or the understanding. You're supposed to be filling yourself up with that as much as you can. And in fact, the avodah which is done without the understanding, as he said, the naseh, is done with the intention of opening up the pipelines of nishma and being able to understand and to feel and to serve Hashem with all of our hearts and souls. Have a wonderful evening, a wonderful week, a wonderful Shabbos.